This is part of my sermon series on her story, salvation history through the women of the Bible. And so, are you there? And Mordecai said to Esther, "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." What are the events leading up to Mordecai's question to Esther? Who knows? Perhaps you have been put in this place, this position of influence for such a time as this. I wonder what implications it might have for us as a community of faith. Could it be that maybe God has brought you to this time in this place for a special purpose that you didn't know about but will know about before you walk out of this sanctuary? Who knows? Perhaps God has led you to this time and this place to be part of salvation history, as Esther was. Let's look at the story and see what were the events that led up to Mordecai's question and Esther's response. In the first chapter, we see that it begins with another queen, Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti has been summoned by King Ahasuerus. Now, modern scholars believe that King Ahasuerus is none other than Xerxes I of the Persian Empire. They believe that Xerxes I has come off a triumphant military campaign, and they're celebrating, and the text tells us they're celebrating for 7 days. And on the 7th day, Ahasuerus summons the queen, Vashti. But the queen doesn't come when called. She's summoned again, but the queen doesn't come when called. And we're left to wonder why. Well, I would think that no woman would want to attend a party of men who've been drinking for 7 days. It doesn't take much imagination to understand why she would say no. Am I right? You see, in a patriarchal society, which this time and place in which we read, in which it was, women are valued either for being a virgin or a young woman, or being a mother, or being a lady of the evening. That was the 3 roles that women had. Now, Queen Vashti is considered to be the mother of the country. She doesn't want to play the role of the lady of the evening. She doesn't want to dance before the men. Can you blame her? She says no. And so that's one strategy for a community of faith in a hostile culture to the faith. Remember, Israel is in exile. And how does the community of faith respond and live among an alien culture that's sometimes hostile to the faith? One strategy is open rebellion, as Vashti did. And what happened to her? Well, she is deposed. And one is led to believe that she loses not only her crown, but her head as well. That is one strategy regarding a hostile society, an oppressive society, is open rebellion. And what does it lead? Sometimes it leads a person to lose their life. What is interesting at the end of the first chapter is that the wise men, the people who counseled the king, says, you cannot let this go unpunished. Because what would happen if all the women in the world, or all the women of the 127 provinces, find out about what Vashti has done? Is not the man the king of his own castle? It's there. And so we see that they decide to hold a beauty contest in chapter 2, a Miss America contest. And Mordecai instructs Esther. Esther is Mordecai's niece. Esther's parents have died, and Mordecai, as her uncle, has raised her. But Mordecai sees this as an opportunity, and he instructs Esther, who is beautiful, to be a part of this beauty pageant, except don't let anyone know that you are a Jew. Keep that identity to yourself. And so the beauty contest goes on, and Esther wins. She is selected queen. And Mordecai thinks that things are going to go better for him and his people with Esther queen. Now, a government official by the name of Haman in chapter 3 is introduced. Now, Mordecai is a God-fearing Jew, and Mordecai doesn't show due deference to Haman. He refuses to bow down. And that's one strategy. Reason why Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman is that Mordecai will not give honor to a person that belongs to God. He will not bow down before Haman. Haman insists, and he plans to get revenge on Mordecai, not only on Mordecai, but because he's a Jew, upon all Jews. And he convinces the king to write an edict that on a certain day in which the lot would fall, that the people in all 127 provinces of Persia would be allowed to take the property of the Jews and take their lives. Where have we heard this before? Does this ring a bell? Mordecai finds out about it, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes, a sign of mourning, and sits at the king's gate at the palace. Word gets that Mordecai is sitting in sackcloth and ashes, and Esther sends a messenger and says, "What are you mourning? Who are you mourning for?" And Mordecai tells Esther about the plan to exterminate the Jews. And Mordecai says to Esther, "I need you to go before the king and plead our case." Esther reminds Mordecai that to go to the king unannounced risks one's life. One just doesn't walk into the throne room without being invited. If the king does not extend the golden scepter, we know what will happen. It is ironic that Vashti, when summoned, doesn't go to the king. She lost her life. Esther fears that she might go to the king when not summoned and lose her life. And then Mordecai puts this question to Esther: "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you've come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Mordecai reminds Esther that another strategy that the community of the faithful employ when in an alien culture, as Persia was, is to blend in. Blend in. Let no one know about your true identity as a Jew or your true identity as a Christian. Blend in. Mordecai reminds Esther that if this program is enforced, her identity will be revealed. And who do you suppose might reveal that identity? The text hints that it's Mordecai. Mordecai might let people know that Esther is a Jew. So in some ways, it's a veiled threat. Don't think that you can hide behind being queen. If that is not enough reason for Esther to act, the final one is, for who knows, perhaps you have been summoned for such a time as this. Use your position of influence for such a time as this. Esther has a change of heart. Up to chapter 3, Esther in many ways has been responsive to what men Mordecai has asked of her. Suddenly in chapter 4, Esther will then be giving orders to Mordecai. She takes charge of her own life, takes charge of the situation. And so Esther will tell Mordecai, tell the people to fast for 3 days, and I will fast for 3 days. And on the third day, I will go to the king. And if he does not extend his supper and I lose my life, well, so be it. Esther goes to the king on the third day, but she doesn't walk straight down the aisle. She simply stands in the alcove, waiting to catch the king's eye. And when she does, the king summons her forward, extends the golden scepter. She makes it sound as if it's the king's idea. It was the king who summoned Esther. So the king looks good in front of all the people. And she sits beside the king. And it pleases the king. And the king says, you have found favor in my eyes. Up to half the kingdom is yours. Esther, what brings you to court today? And he wants Esther to tell. We want her to say about what the evil Haman has plotted against the Jews. But she says nothing. She doesn't mention Haman, doesn't mention the plot. She simply says, if it pleases the king, will he come to dinner tonight and dine with me? And oh, by the way, bring Haman with you. And so the king says yes. And Haman thinks he's being rewarded. He thinks highly of himself. And so they attend the banquet, and it pleases the king. And he says to Esther, up to half my kingdom, what is it that you want? Again, Esther doesn't say. We think she should, but she doesn't. She says, if it pleases the king, have him come and dine with me tomorrow night. Oh, by the way, bring Haman, and I will tell you what I want. Well, Haman is so impressed with himself. He walks out of the room and he's walking back to his house, and he comes across Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't bow down before Haman. And Haman is incensed, and he says to his wife, can you believe what Mordecai just did? She says, well, that's a personal affront. You need to get even. Why don't you build a gallows 60 cubits high so everyone can see what Mordecai has done to you, and you can take your revenge. The idea seems good to Haman, so he has the gallows built. That night, the king is not able to sleep. Some might think it's a coincidence, but Frederick Buechner says coincidences are simply that which happens which does not. That which happens in which God is anonymous. A coincidence is that which happens in which God is anonymous, meaning God is behind it, meaning God's fingerprints are all over it. It just so happens the king is not able to sleep, and the king reads the annals of the kings, the acts of the king, and he finds out that Mordecai had foiled a plot against the king, and he asked his servant, how was Mordecai rewarded? And the servant says, nothing was done for Mordecai. Haman just so happens to enter into the king's presence, and the king asks Haman, what should the king do to honor a person? Haman thinks it's him. He says, the king, if he wishes to honor a person, should allow that person to wear the king's robes, should allow that person to ride the king's horse, and should have a personal attendant say, this is what the king does for whom he wishes to honor. The king says, that sounds good. Do it as you have just said to my servant Mordecai. This is the beginning of the end for Haman. They attend the dinner. Again, the king is well pleased and repeats, Esther, tell me what you want, and I'll grant it up to half my kingdom. And Esther says this, if it pleases the king, save my life and save the life of my people. Notice she doesn't talk about Haman. She says, if it pleases the king, this woman who's been anonymous as to her real identity as a Jew, she says, if it pleases the king, save my life and save my people. And the king says, what are you talking about? And then Esther says what Haman has plotted to do. And Haman realizes he's in hot water. The king is so incensed by what he has heard, he has to take a stroll in the garden. Haman sees this as an opportunity to save his neck, and he pleads personally to Esther. He comes closer and sits on the lounge where Esther is reclining. The king walks in and thinks that Haman wants the queen as well as his kingdom. And it just so happens that Esther's servant says, oh, take a look at the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai. And the king says, have him hanged from those very gallows. And so we see that Esther is to be numbered among those who use their position of influence to be part of God's salvation history. How Esther takes initiative. She makes important decisions. And it's important for this very reason. Instead of openly rebelling against a hostile culture, instead of simply blending in, Esther represents the third way. And the third way is strategically using your position and influence to subvert the evil intent of those who seek to do you harm or seek to go against God's will. She represents the third way, strategic resistance. The kind of resistance that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor, a theologian. He was a diplomat. He was a man of peace. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this when it comes to an evil empire. He said, it's not enough for the church to bandage up those who've been run over by the wheels of injustice. Ministry of compassion has its place, but sometimes the church must do more than bandage up those who've been run over by the wheels of injustice. Sometimes the church is called for to put a metal rod and stop what's happening. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was willing to use his position and influence to be part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. Raoul Wallenberg, he was a Swedish diplomat who was serving in Budapest, Hungary. Raoul Wallenberg was willing to write tens of thousands of visas during 1944 when he heard about what the Jews were doing, what Hitler was doing to the Jews. He saved their lives from the concentration camp. He used his position of influence to be part of God's salvation history. How many of you heard about Oskar Schindler? He was a businessman. He used his position of influence to hire Jews at his factories, saving them from the concentration camps. How many of you heard of Rosa Parks? She didn't have much influence. She didn't think. She was simply a maid. But Rosa Parks one day was so tired from work, she refused to get up from the front seat of the bus and go to the back seat. And the civil rights movement was born. Today, we are witnessing that another civil rights movement, that police officers, not all police officers, just some police officers, that when pulling over African Americans, a simple traffic violation can escalate. I happen to know African American pastors. I went to school with them, and every one of them tells this tale of getting in a car and being pulled over because they have a nice car. And some police officers in the South believe every African American who has a nice car is what? A drug dealer. So they have them get out of the car at gunpoint. Have you ever had a gun pointed at you? They have. Get out at gunpoint, and they open up the trunk and they take everything out trying to find the drugs. They have similar tales. Right now, there is a march in Selma to Washington, D.C. There are people who believe that God has called them to speak up and use their position of influence for such a time as this. At the community breakfast yesterday, I had a member tell me a thank you letter she received from a young woman whom this teacher took in. The mother was on drugs, and this teacher knew that this child was not going to go anywhere with that kind of environment. She took the teenager into her own home. The teenager grew up, became a pastor. Her husband is a pastor. They just saved the pool for their community. Who knows? Maybe God has called you for such a time as this to be part of salvation history, to make a difference in a child's life, to make a difference for those who are wrongly accused, for those whom the justice system does not serve them well? Who knows? Maybe God has called you to make a difference. You can use your position of influence at home, at work, and even here at this church so that we can accomplish what God has called us to be and to become, a shining light, a city set on a hill where people can hear the good news of Jesus Christ, know the joy of being forgiven, and know the justice of the gospel. It can happen if you believe in providence. Who knows? Maybe God has called you to make a difference in the world for Jesus Christ. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.